What I was originally going to do for this video was give a review of all of the books that I've read this year, but that I go into quite a bit of detail about the books that I do talk about in the video, and it was getting pretty long, so I decided to do it in parts. So this first video is going to be about the first 7 books that I've read this year. I'm going to give you my overall rating for each book, and then how I felt about the world building, characters, writing, and plot. I give a star rating for each of the individual categories that I'm going to talk about. However, I need to warn you, the math does not math. So I don't take the average of all of these and then that decides my overall rating for it, because my overall enjoyment of the book influences what the overall rating is. So they're kind of 2 separate things. This list is also in the order of which I read them. I did not rank them by my least or most favorite books at all. So without further ado, hope you enjoy. The first book I read this year was The Last Cuentista. This book is about a girl named Petra. A comet is about to hit Earth and wipe out all life on it, so her and her family and several other thousands of people are going to be boarding these spaceships to go to a new planet that they found that can sustain human life. And the journey is going to take about 800 years or something like that. So a lot of them are going to go into cryo, except for a select few who will be monitoring the ship and the crew who are asleep for the entire journey. The crew is hijacked by this extremist cult, and everybody's memories are wiped, and Petra seems to be the only one who actually remembers what life was like on Earth. So she becomes the Cuentista means storyteller, so she becomes the last storyteller of old stories that were told on Earth. This is a middle grade book. It's science fiction. I gave it 3 stars overall. It was okay. It was not my favorite. The cover is actually the only reason that I'm actually keeping the book, because it's absolutely gorgeous. It even has this cool print on the cover of a snake spiraling through the stars, which if you read the book, you will understand the reference for that. As far as the elements of this book go, the world building is the best part of it. The planet that they go to is very believable. The tech is really cool that's on the ship and what they use down on the planet. There's Mexican mythology and folklore in this, which is really cool to see. If I had to give everything a star rating on its own, I would probably give the world building a 4 out of 5 stars. The plot I'd give a 3.5. It's a pretty solid story. There's some intrigue with these kids who are bonding over these stories that Petra is telling them. It's a pretty standard story. Young girl trying to fight this establishment that's overtaken her entire life, and she's the only one who can save everybody. There are some twists and turns, that are okay. They didn't really blow me away, but I think for a middle grade, it's pretty good. The ending did fall a little bit flat. One thing that you really want to try to do if you are a writer is make sure that you are giving readers payoffs. So if you're going to talk about something a lot in your story, there has to be a payoff for it at some point in the future. And there is one thing in this book, I don't really want to say it because I don't really want to spoil anything, but there is one thing in this book that they talk a lot about, the whole story is building up towards, and they don't really deliver on that part specifically, which I was a little bit disappointed with. It kind of cuts off right before you really get to see what the end result is. So that was probably the biggest fault as far as the plot goes, but otherwise pretty solid. For the characters, this was actually the weakest point of the book, and I don't know if I can really fault it for that, because a lot of the people have been kind of brainwashed or they don't have their memories, so I guess it's kind of hard to have a personality when you're basically being made to be a drone. But there were really only 2 characters in this that were kind of interesting, and that was Petra and this one kid named Fox. The others were just kind of meh. So I would give it that 2 out of 5 stars. And then for the writing, an average 3. It was okay. It's an easy read, but it's nothing that really stands out in my mind as having a particular style or tone or anything like that. The second book that I read this year was Dracula. This book I gave a 3.5 stars. I think I said in a past video that I gave it 4 stars. I did round it up on Goodreads because you can only give solid ratings. And I will say, I think after having sat with this book for a longer time, I still love it, so I think I probably would keep it at the 4 stars now, although I definitely have reasons for having given it 3.5 stars to begin with. I think everybody knows the overall premise of Dracula. Basically, these group of heroes have to go up against Dracula, who's a vampire and is basically trying to take over the world. So a lot of it is about trying to outsmart him and chasing him all around London and Romania to defeat him. The world building in this I would give 5 stars. It was so atmospheric and beautifully detailed. All of the descriptions are very eerie, also beautiful in a strange way. The vampire lore in this is very interesting. It was very elaborate, and you could picture everything from Whitby, where they are for most of the time when they're in London, to the landscape in Transylvania. So that was a super strong point that the book had. The plot I would give 3.5 stars. It's a solid plot of fighting the evil demon and trying to save the girl, but there are some very strange choices that they make. In particular, if you watched my previous videos, the man brain versus the child brain was like the most ridiculous concept that I've ever heard of, and they talked about it so much that it really annoyed me, and that was kind of one of the reasons that brought my original rating down a little bit. But otherwise, you know, it's a solid plot. Characters, I would give a 3 out of 5. Jonathan Harker was definitely my favorite, and I was the most invested whenever the story was telling things through his point of view. Mina is also a pretty solid female character for the time that this was written in. She's intelligent and capable, but she does suffer a little bit from the like purity obsession that this time period had. The other characters were okay. I do actually really appreciate that this book had men crying a lot in it, and it wasn't a really big deal. It was actually kind of like celebrated anytime that they showed emotion, which I thought was pretty cool and something I didn't expect given how toxic masculinity is kind of seemed like it's been around forever. And then Dracula was pretty scary every time that he was actually present in the story, which is shockingly not that much. He's kind of like this like mysterious force that they're chasing after, but they don't encounter all that often. But there are a couple scenes that still in my mind stick out when he was attacking someone that is pretty scary. And then the rating, I would give a 3 out of 5 as well. It's pretty easy to read overall for a classic. However, there were certain points where it either rambled on too much, where words could have been minced and it would have made the story go a little bit faster. And also they did a couple like weird dialects that made it almost impossible to read. And I had to put down a couple times just because my brain was like, I needed a break. The next book that I read this year is called Killbox by Anna Guire. This is actually the 4th book in the Samantha Jax series, which starts with Grimspace. So I think it would probably be better for me to tell you what Grimspace is about instead of jumping to the 4th book in the series. That might give away a lot of spoilers. So Grimspace is about a science fiction book set far, far in the future. I don't know if there's actually a date that's put to it, but it's about this girl named Samantha Jax, and she is a jumper. So she has a particular gene in her that allows her to connect with Grimspace, which is basically this world's version of like warp space. So ships will like jump into Grimspace, and then there are different beacons that these jumpers can connect to that can drag a ship into a different part of space. So in the first book, Jax is actually in jail. She's been imprisoned for crashing a ship that had a lot of galactic delegates on it, and she's being held responsible for all of their deaths. So there's this crew that breaks her out because they believe that she's innocent, basically, and they want to help them to get back at this like galactic force that has imprisoned her. So as the series goes on, things get more and more sticky. There's different governments that are vying for power. There's aliens that they have to come encounter with and try to make alliances with because there's a bigger threat in the galaxy that they need to deal with, which by the time you get to Killbox, there's actually a war that's about to brew. So this book is all about the military force that's trying to like get built to fight this enemy called the Morgut, which are basically like really creepy spider aliens. So that's super fun for me because I hate spiders. Killbox I gave an overall of 4.5 stars. So I absolutely love this series, and the spin-off series of this one is actually one of my favorite science fiction books of all time. So I'm pretty invested in these characters in this world, which makes me a little bit biased, but this particular one is not my favorite in the series, but it was very good. As far as the world building goes, it's a 5 stars for me. By this point in the series, the world is huge. We have a whole bunch of different alien species that we've visited and even tried to like make alliances with. The whole Grimspace concept is really well fleshed out. There are a whole bunch of different like political forces within this universe. This one, we're getting into a war. There's like crazy tech and people with psychic powers. It's just like a very, very full world, and I absolutely love it. For the plot, I would give it a 4 out of 5. It's pretty solid. Again, not my favorite in the series, but things keep tying together from previous books, so you get to see how past events are influencing what's happening in the current time. All of the things that have led up to this has created the military force that they're basically trying to use to defend themselves. People's powers are expanding. There are different characters that have different skill sets, and they, you know, keep growing with each book, and it's done very well, I think. And then so these are technically supposed to be science fiction romances, but the romances are really more of a subplot, and it's actually not my favorite part of the book. But in this one, it was far less annoying than it has been in previous books, so it was okay. Characters, I'd have to give it a 5 out of 5. Like I said, this is the 4th book, so I'm pretty attached to all of the characters. Jax is a really great main character. She definitely goes through her phases where she gets a little bit annoying, especially in the 1st book, but there is a plot-driven reason for why she's kind of annoying. She has a lot of growth by this point, and it's really cool to see. And I really do have to give this book 5 stars for the characters, because literally my favorite character is a giant bug. It's a praying mantis alien basically, and he is my favorite of all time.
Okay.
So yeah, a lot of the side characters are also good. I don't love March, who is the love interest, but what are you gonna do? You can't win them all. I'd still give it 5 stars, specifically for other characters in the book. The writing, I would give a 3.5. It's pretty good. It's definitely not the best I've seen from Anna Guire. It's easy to read, but sometimes it's a little bit on the nose, and she does a lot of summaries from previous books, which honestly, if you don't read them like very close together, then it's fine, because it's helpful to remind you of things. But if you're reading these back to back, it can kind of get annoying to like have a summary of something that you just read. Moving on to the next book that I read, that'd be Dorian Gray, or The Picture of Dorian Gray. I gave this book a 3 stars. It wasn't my favorite classic that I've ever read. I know it actually is a lot of people's favorites, but it just wasn't mine, because I'm not the biggest fan of corruption arcs, which is basically the main plot in this book. Is there's a very beautiful young boy named Dorian Gray, and everybody's kind of obsessed with him because of how beautiful and pure and innocent he looks. But then there's this one guy, Sir Henry, who kind of takes it upon himself to lead Dorian down this like dark path. So he's kind of the instigator for Dorian's corruption and kind of obsession with hedonistic lifestyles and arts and all of this kind of stuff. So all of the wickedness that Dorian does, he imbues into this picture that he has of himself. So all of the ugly things he does, the picture actually takes on for him, so he stays looking young and beautiful. For the world building, I would give this a 4 out of 5 stars. The descriptions were very good. Everything was very easy to picture, and there definitely are some very atmospheric kind of scenes that come out of this, like around the picture or in kind of the shadier areas that Dorian goes to, that I think were done very well. The plot, I would give it a 3 out of 5. Again, corruption arcs are not my favorite, but this one was done better than most, just because it did actually give reason as to why Dorian is becoming a corrupt person. It also kind of showed him trying to fight that at different times, and then his friend manipulating him into thinking that he isn't actually a good person. The descriptions of how bad Dorian and like his friends were are very, very vague, which I know is a product of the time. He probably couldn't really say what exactly that they were getting into, so you can kind of imagine it, but it made it a little bit hard to believe that he was as bad as they were saying he was, just because there was no real examples of how terrible he was. For the characters, I'd also give it a 3 out of 5 stars. They were well enough described, but I mean, despite giving a reason for why Dorian was kind of becoming corrupt, it was a little bit still hard to understand why exactly he was doing some of the things that he was doing. They kind of just happened very abruptly. I don't know. They were okay. They weren't the best written characters I've ever seen. And then the writing, I would also give a 3 out of 5 stars. It kind of flip-flopped a little bit. Like, there was some writing that was really beautiful and had really great quotes that I really appreciated. Also had some philosophical questions that I thought were pretty interesting about, you know, the purpose of art and beauty and the soul kind of like being connected. But some of it was a little bit too much, and I could have done without. Like, there was one chapter in particular that I remember that was literally just pages and pages and pages on materialistic goods. So it literally just went on about art and fabrics and jewels and all of these things that it was like a couple times that was like interesting, but when I got to be like almost the entire chapter that was literally just talking about this materialistic stuff, it was kind of annoying. The next book I read was romantic comedy, and this was probably my most hated book of the entire year so far. I gave it 1 star and I got rid of it the second that I finished it. This book is basically about, I don't even remember the character names, but it is about a woman who works at basically Saturday Night Live and their musical guest star who kind of end up falling in love. And like part of it takes place over the pandemic, so there's this section where they're just emailing each other back and forth until they finally get together towards the latter part of it. I will be honest, I started skimming after 3 pages because of reasons we'll get into as I go through the categories. So for world building, I would give this a 2 out of 5. It was entirely info dumping, which is why I started skimming it. The first like 3 pages were just literally solid info dump about what Saturday Night Live is like, their schedule, what it's like to work there as a writer, and like the typical cycle that they go through with all of their famous guest stars. If you love Saturday Night Live, then maybe you will love this book, but I got tired of it really quick. The plot, I would also give a 2 out of 5. The premise was okay, but I think it had kind of like bad execution. It basically starts because the girl has this like Danny rule or something like that, where men can date above their status, but women will never be able to date above their status because men are too shallow to consider a woman who's not attractive. So I didn't love that part of it. I also thought that the part where they're writing emails back and forth was not done well because it was, first off, too long of a time that this went on, and they only had like 3 interactions before that. There wasn't enough of a build-up before they were separated for me to care about the characters or their interactions with each other. The characters I would give a 1 out of 5 because I literally did not care about a single one of them. I can't even remember their names, which is pretty rare for me. And then yeah, the rating I would also give a 1 out of 5 just because of how much it relied on info dumping and the emails that were back and forth, which are also kind of info dumping. Moving on to one that is much more exciting. The next book I read was Djinn in Cairo. This book is my first 5-star of the year. It's actually a short story, but it's 43 pages long, so it's pretty long for a short story. This book is about a woman called Fatma. I am so sorry if I mispronounced that, but she is a detective for like supernatural crimes in 1920s Cairo. So she works with the everyday police who deal with more like human-related crimes to help them when there is anything involving a supernatural being. So the book starts with a Djinn who gets murdered, and she goes with the police to investigate how and why, and kind of a mystery of like what is going on with this dead Djinn and this like ritual that they found him sacrificed in, basically. For the world building, we give it a 5 out of 5. It's got steampunk vibes. It has all sorts of different supernatural creatures, including Djinn and mechanical angels, and a whole bunch of other like Arabic and Egyptian mythological creatures. It's also got cults and assassins, and again, a society that has both humans and creatures living like in harmony. It was just a really cool vibe, and I'm very excited to read the next book, The Master of Djinn, because of how cool the world building was in this one. The plot I would also give a 5 out of 5. It had murder, it had mystery, it had a potential apocalyptic event, and it was all done within 43 pages, which was, I think, very impressively executed. The characters I would also give a 5 out of 5. Fatma is a great main character, and the author did a really good job of establishing her character within the first like seconds that she's introduced. There's also, I unfortunately forget her name now. I can't even remember their names, which is pretty rare for me. But there is an assassin that she kind of teams up with at one point. So the like kind of witty, dry, eclectic Fatma against this like feral and like flirty kind of assassin was a great dynamic. The robotic angels that they featured in the short story were super fascinating and like just like really interesting to read about. And then the rating, you guessed it, it's also a 5 out of 5. It was tight, it was purposeful, it didn't waste a single word, it was honestly really effective, and I would say almost perfect. The next book that I read was Legendborn. This is about Bree, who is a young black girl who is going to a summer program at a college that she wants to potentially go to when she graduates high school. Her mother was killed shortly before this happened, so she's going through a grieving period and she's very angry. So she's having a hard time going through everyday life, and then she comes across these people called the Legendborn and kind of notices them doing magic, and they try to make her forget, and she can't, and and then she has this memory of when her mother died, where she remembers somebody also trying to erase her memory at that time. So this book is about, she tries to infiltrate the Legendborn to find out if they had anything to do with her mother's murder. This book is called Legendborn because it also has a lot to do with the Legend of Arthur. So the Legendborn are basically descendants of the Knights from the Round Table and Merlin and Arthur who were fighting in this demon war. So while Bria is trying to figure out whether they had anything to do with her mother's death, she's also now getting trained to fight in this demon war alongside of them. I gave this book 4.5 stars. It was really well done. The world building I would give a 4 out of 5 stars. It was elaborate. The way that it uses the Legend of Arthur and all of that history I think is really fascinating. So, you know, it takes something familiar and like twists it into something new, which is one of the best things that you can do if you're writing your own story. I will say sometimes it's almost a little bit too elaborate. There are definitely certain points where it's not necessarily info dumping because it is done kind of in a conversation setting, but it is a lot to like wrap your head around when it really gets into like the nitty-gritty of what this society is about and how it works, and there's different magic systems, so it is very, very elaborate and it's well done, but sometimes it's a little bit too much, so that's why I didn't give it a perfect 5 stars. The plot I would give a 5 out of 5. It has chosen ones, a demon war, this mystery about whether somebody was involved with killing her mother. It has commentary on racism and classism and aspects of what it's like to grieve and, you know, the kind of like different emotions and approaches that you can take with that. It deals with generational trauma. It has different magic systems that different people practice. It's basically got everything, so I would say the plot is pretty solid. The characters I would give a 4 out of 5 stars. For the most part, they're all really good. They're all very unique. Brie is a little bit annoying sometimes, and it's hard to like judge her really because she is going through a very difficult time. She's got a lot of anger built, you know, from her mother's death, but she is a little bit unforgiving at sometimes, which kind of annoyed me. And then the writing I would also give a 5 out of 5. I think it was very well done. It's an easy read. It's an interesting read. I highly recommend it. And that is it for part 1 of the books I've read in 2023. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Leave a comment on what you've read so far this year. I'd love to hear what books you've enjoyed or hated even. I guess that's it. See you next time.